Yes, indeed, we're back. Thanks for hanging out. Welcome to the only podcast in the visible universe that goes upstream from politics and social institutions to the question of culture, the source of it all, and how to fix the DNA damage done to the West by political correctness, neo-Marxist bullies, and the Kardashian empire. Great to have you. It's a very important topic. It's on the surface of the story, it's just about Canada and an arcane bit of legislation. But it's really about a whole broad spectrum of important questions about free speech versus government-mandated, compelled speech. And that's a concern shared by all my listeners, not just in America, but around the world, who believe in reasoned discourse and who want to genuinely protect the rights of minorities from unjust discrimination. I'm talking about the recent passage of a bill in Canada called Bill C-16. I'm amazed at how few Canadians even know about this. It was somewhat debated by a committee of the Canadian Senate regarding the nearly infinite variety of pronouns that transgendered activists and their allies in the media want to impose on others in the way they speak, in the way they address them. Today's guests played major roles in the opposition to this crazy bill and to the ideology that surrounds it and supports it. Joining me to fill in some of the gaps and provide some on-the-ground, behind-the-scenes accounts of the debate leading up to the passage of the bill is Senator Don Plett. He grew up in Manitoba, in the suitably named landmark Manitoba, in the literal center of Canada, I've since learned. And so this Maritimer is honored to speak with the Senator. He's been a successful businessman and entrepreneur. He's a father and grandfather, and in 2009 was appointed to the Canadian Senate by then Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Senator Plett, it's an honor to talk to you, sir.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Joining us now from Toronto, Senator Plett's in the East Block of the Canadian Parliament buildings in Ottawa. We also welcome back to the show Professor Jordan Peterson. He is a professor of psychology, the author of Maps of Meaning, and the creator of the self-authoring suite. He's one of the people who gave testimony before the Senate committee on Bill C-16. He's been a guest on my show before a number of times, and it's always a red pill learning experience. And I would say that Jordan Peterson's been the highest profile opponent of Bill C-16 and of the politically correct totalitarianism that supports it. So it's so great to have you back, Dr. Peterson.
Thanks, Patrick.
You're looking good. You're looking good. My wife says I have a face for radio. You're sort of the face of the opposition to Bill C-16. I wanted to ask you about the public reaction. You get letters from people around the world. What's the proportion of you're the devil versus keep it up, we support you?
I get 0 negative letters.
Really?
Literally. I think I've got 1 in the last 3 months, something like that, and hundreds of positive letters. And the ratio on YouTube is about 50 to 1, I would say, likes to dislikes for the videos that are not only the videos that are associated with this political issue, but to the other videos that I have online. So I don't know what it is. You know, I'm not getting deluged with hate mail, and I think I can't figure it out. And it hasn't been the case right from the beginning. Mm-hmm. I don't think I've had more than 10 or 11 emails that have been, you know, critical, much less savage.
Sure.
So I don't know why that is. I can't figure any of this out anyway. So that's just one more mystery to add to a very large pile of mysteries.
Sure. Well, numerically speaking, if someone has gender dysphoria or they believe that they're a man trapped in a woman's body or vice versa, I understand it affects about 1/3%. Now, that's like drawing a circle and a single line to the radius. That's a very small sliver of a small number. Yes. So the influence that it's had in the culture is overwhelming. It's way out of proportion to the actual numbers of people we're talking about.
Well, it's because, first of all, we want to be very clear about one thing. We are not talking about transgendered people. Mm-hmm. We're talking about transgendered activists. Right? They're not the same thing. Yeah. I've got at least 30 letters from transgender people saying that they fully support what I'm doing. And there's a lot of transgender people who made videos on YouTube saying exactly the same thing. And since there aren't that many transgendered people, then that's actually worthy of some note. And one of the things that we have to stop doing is assuming that just because someone either is part of a minority group or declares that they're part of a minority group, that somehow gives them the right to act on behalf of that minority group. Mm-hmm. Allowing that just plays right into the hands of the identity politics types. And so the transgender people who write me, they all say the same thing. We're not all the
Yeah.
same. These people don't speak for us. They've made us a public target. We want to just get on with our lives. Most of us just want to be known as the opposite pronoun, and we're not very thrilled about the fact that we're flavor of the month for the postmodern neo-radicals, neo-Marxist
Yeah.
radicals.
Yeah, there's no monolithic block called the trans community. It's like the black community or the gay community. People are individuals. But this goes to something that's been a theme in the presentations that you've made that I've enjoyed, Dr. Peterson, and that is the groupthink mentality, where it's this collective tribe that requires not just tolerance but promotion, forgetting that individuals within that tribe may very, very strongly disagree with their own self-anointed spokespeople.
Well, the thing that psychological literature on this is absolutely clear. So let's look at the men and women, for example. There are substantial differences in personality and even larger differences in interest between men and women. Mm-hmm. And those seem to be primarily biologically predicated. They pop out at puberty, and they're largest in the Scandinavian countries where the sociocultural surround has been flattened out to some degree. Mm-hmm. But the variability within women, say, and the variability within men is far larger than the variability between them. And that's the case it's certainly the case for racial groups, and it's even more the case for ethnic groups. So mm-hmm. what that is to say is there's far more difference within a group than there is between groups, which is, of course, what the damn anti-racists have been saying for the last 100 years. Mm-hmm. And now all of a sudden we're supposed to just throw our hands up and say, oh, no. These groups are identifiably different. You're supposed to stake your identity on them. They all think sufficiently differently so that you have to promote diversity on the basis of these categories so that we get a diversity of opinions. But having said all that, they're all somehow exactly the same and should be treated equivalently. It's so incoherent that it's just beyond comprehension.
George Orwell, call your office. If this doesn't induce them to read Animal Farm, some animals are equal, some animals are more equal than others.
Yes.
Senator Plett, I read with great interest the speeches you gave on the second and third reading on Bill C-16, and one of the things that you said, this is a quote, this legislation could have a disproportionate impact on women. Is the end game here the forced dissolution of the word women and men? Because I'm thinking that this is going to impact things like Catholic education in Ontario, where you have this rich body of Christian teaching about the human person, specifically a whole way of thinking about this called the theology of the body, developed under St. John Paul the Great, in which it reflects the biblical view of the human person, male and female. I would imagine that some trans activist plants, for lack of a better phrase, inside the school system are going to push this to disallow Christian teaching with respect to sex, that we don't believe in this infinite fluid gender view. Have you been advised, or have people kind of come to you back channel saying this has huge implications for education generally, but Christian schools in particular?
Well, Patrick, without a doubt, and Professor Peterson will be well aware that in Ontario already they are passing legislation that is going to prevent people from calling me a father or my wife a mother. And so I think that is the very, very start and the essence of what you are saying, and that is indeed what they want. I'm so happy that Professor Peterson is getting mostly the good mail, and I guess that leaves the rest for me, because I haven't been quite as fortunate as he has with that, and most of my mail has been the opposite. Now, I guess that's possibly because I'm in politics, and people want to do that. But without a doubt, Patrick, I believe that this is the well, we're not in the beginning. We're already well on the way to taking the word mother, father, woman, man. And again, Professor Peterson is quite correct when he talks about many of the transgender people and their wishes. We had a witness that I'm sure you're aware of, Theron Myers, who is a biological male and identifying as a female. She was one of our witnesses who was very explicit on exactly that issue, that I believe there are two genders. I just happen to want to be the other gender. And so you're absolutely right when you say that we are moving in the direction of losing the title of men and women entirely.
Yeah, and we don't want to make this hypothetical. I mean, I debated a lawyer called Brenda Cosman back at the University of Toronto about Bill C-16 back in probably November or so, and mostly what she did was engage in ad hominem attacks on me. But anyways, here's something really interesting. So as soon as Bill C-16, she insisted that Bill C-16 was innocuous, and that it was also, say, as far as it was going to go, and it didn't have any real teeth, and there weren't any legislative provisions in it, for example, to actually criminalize failure to use these preferred pronouns. But the federal justice minister, refused to consider an amendment that would make that explicit. And then the day that the bill passed, Cosman wrote an article for the Globe and Mail, and I just want to read you tiny bits of it. So the first thing that she and her co-writer said was, from driver's licenses to gender assignment on birth certifications, we need to fundamentally reimagine the relationship between sex and gender. It's like, yeah, well, that's exactly what I said they were aiming at.
Yep.
And then the other thing they say, quite straightforwardly, is the work of real equality has only just begun. Turning formal rights into substantive protections for trans and gender non-binary individuals will be a hard process. And Bill C-16 provides only the simplest of tools. And so they couldn't even wait a day after the bill was passed to note that, well, that's all well and good that we've got these protections, but we're barely beginning on what's going to be a long and rocky road. And if you look at what the, what do they call those? The Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, if you look at their guidelines for curriculum development over the next, from kindergarten to grade 8, it's absolutely clear that what they're producing, and they're not making any bones about it, is that the purpose of the education system is to produce social justice oriented students. So it's indoctrination. They've even subordinated math and science training to that. So this is no secret. It's no conspiracy. It's all you have to do is read the damn descriptions and you figure out exactly what's going to happen next.
And of course, the justice minister, when she was on, and I asked her about the compelled speech, was very explicit in saying that it is not the intent of this bill to compel any speech. And as Professor Peterson says, when I then went forward to bring an amendment in to just simply clarify that and say for greater certainty, not changing anything that the justice minister had said, but simply stating for greater certainty, the justice minister was the first one to came out saying they would not support my amendment, even if the Senate adopted it.
I wonder why. And why did the link on the Department of Justice website linking Bill C-16 to the Ontario policies of the Human Rights Commission, that disappeared? And I understand that someone was on the case enough to retain a copy of it. I mean, this is just smoke and mirrors.
We certainly did. Professor Peterson did, and so yes, we have copies of that.
Yeah, that's scandalous in two ways. The first way is that it's scandalous. The second way is that the press hasn't covered it as a scandal, and it's a bloody scandal. It's an attempt to cover up the clear relationship between the Ontario Human Rights Commission policies, which are absolutely appalling, and this new C-16 doctrine, and to further justify the statements of lawyers like Cosman that this is really a harmless bit of fluff legislation, even though it's really important that it be passed. And here's something that's really interesting too, Patrick, that's really worth thinking about, because, the hypothesis has been, since I came out against Bill C-16, let's say that I'm some anti-transgender person and a racist and all those things, which are just palpably absurd. But this new legislation is part and parcel of a set of policies that writes a social constructionist and postmodernist view of identity into our legal system. And the legal system in Canada, by the way, has been completely invaded by social justice lawyers who are hell-bent on doing precisely this. But here's the issue. So there's 4 tiers of identity, you might say, that are associated conceptually with this issue. There's biological sex, which the most radical people consider a social construct itself, as one of their spokespersons said on national essentially on national TV when they were debating me. Then there's gender identity, then there's gender expression, then there's sexual proclivity. And that legislation is laid out to strongly imply or perhaps even mandate that those things vary independently, which is an outright lie. They're incredibly tightly correlated,
yes.
virtually at 0.99, so that virtually everyone who's a biological male identifies as a male, dresses as a male, and is heterosexual in sexual preference. You're looking at a tiny minority of people who don't match up that way. So the idea that those are independent is absurd. It just makes a mockery of the idea of independence. But more importantly, for the transgender types, it's like, okay, guys, here's the deal. The new legislation basically says that your identity is socially constructed. And more, it actually goes beyond that. It goes beyond that to make the claim that not only is it socially constructed, it's fundamentally merely a consequence of personal choice. Well, the argument that the gay activists and the transgender activists have used for all these years effectively to require that the rest of society recognize their mode of being as, let's say, sufficiently normative and valid and ontologically valid, is that it's biological. I was born this way.
Yeah.
Well, that the legislation makes that claim, essentially makes that claim illegal. Okay, so now if I'm a right-wing bigot, let's say, my attitude is quite straightforward. If your gender indeterminacy is a sociocultural construct, then we can educate you out of it by definition. And if it's a whim, well, then there's just nothing to talk about at all. You can bloody well step in line with regards to normalcy like the rest of us who sacrificed a certain amount of individuality to the social collective. So basically, they've demolished the best protection they had. I tried to point that out to the senators, but no, that was a no-go. So
well, it's because you're a committee of one, Dr. Peterson. One senator tried to just kind of give you I call it the barge pole treatment. You're out there on a barge away. You're a déclassé. We can't even cite what your enemies say because it's so obviously that you're wrong. But isn't this an example of the left eating its own? Because if gender is simply a matter of a whim, a subjective intuition, then the whole the construct of male and female, and therefore women's rights, seems to be undermined, if not demolished. Because I know feminists are angry at this too. No, I am a woman. I don't just choose it one day.
Feminists are very, very, very upset about this. We had a group of feminists a group 4 women from Quebec that were in, and were very upset, and in fact demanded that there at least be a gender-based analysis done, which the government says they've done, but they are refusing to release the results of that. And so this very, very clearly, and that's one of the reasons I found it so very disheartening that strong feminist women in our own Senate just absolutely would not give even any second thought before they voted in favor of this legislation.
You've been called all manner of things, Senator Plett, from bigot, white, Christian, male, all the obviously evil qualities. But it doesn't matter what your skin color is. It doesn't matter what your worldview is, because if someone like Theron Meyer, who is a devotee of free speech and reasoned discourse, someone who identifies as trans, but without the activist part, without the anger and the agenda, Theron's testimony was not heavily scrutinized. It was almost like a dog and pony show, rubber stamping an a priori decision. That was the impression as a viewer. I wasn't there in the room, obviously. Did you get that impression that it was a show to say, look, well, we did debate it?
Well, listen, I mean, when Theron was there, she was there together with Dr. Gadsad.
Yeah.
And of course, the senators opposite came just short of saying that Dr. Assad absolutely promoted the culture of genocide, and yet his testimony was almost verbatim what Theron Meyer's was. But of course, they needed to choose who they were going to attack. So it was easier to attack Dr. Gadsad than it was to attack Theron Meyer when she said exactly the same thing. And the most interesting part of her testimony was that The reason she believed and the reason she loved being in Canada, of course, being from Britain, was because of the freedom of speech that we had here. And now she was going to be compelled, as Dr. Peterson has said many times, that she was going to be compelled to say things. But of course, they had a very, very hard time attacking Theron Meyer and just kind of dismissed her out of hand and went after Dr. Gadsad for his beliefs. And so it was very interesting, the animosity, and I was very disappointed. I understand people on the street who aren't well versed in some of what's happening, that they can maybe have this anger, but for senators to have the anger that was displayed to the witnesses that we brought in, and then when we went to clause by clause, very highly educated senators, lawyers, judges, who said there was no compelling testimony given by any of the witnesses that we had called forward, that there was in fact any truth to anything that I had been saying.
Yes, well, and Kosman in her article called the debate on this, she said specifically that, I've got to find it here. She called it hateful. Oh yes, here we go. These messages, that would be our messages, even got their day on the Senate floor, where they found some sympathetic ears. If not for the tremendous efforts of other senators, experts, advocates, trans people, of course not counting Theron Meyer, and their incredible parents, these hateful ideas could have blocked Bill C-16 from becoming legal reality. It's like, you know, I don't think it would be a very easy matter for Kosman and her ilk to go through the testimony that I delivered and Bruce Party delivered and General Jared Brown and also Theron Meyer at the Senate and extract out a single hateful line.
Right.
It doesn't matter because
it doesn't matter.
It's just it's completely irrelevant.
That Professor Peterson, I would take for myself as well in the entire testimony. First of all, going back a few years when we were debating Bill 279, which was a private member's bill dealing with the same thing, and now on C-16, throughout the entire testimony, I never once discounted one witness, one advocate of the bill. I believe we all the witnesses that we called in, treated them with the utmost of respect. And then I get emails and letters and people calling me the most obscene name, and then with that a kind of as a closing comment, and you are rude. Well, when I look at what they called me, I would suggest that some people might call that at least, if not rude, very, very close to being
or demanding that you do things that are anatomically impossible. Right.
Physically impossible for me to do. Yes.
What if someone whose hurt feelings are worn on their sleeve were to hear this interview, and if I were to say that I would prefer to call Theron he, because I don't believe in what's the best way to put it? If one is not necessarily convinced that going through the full so-called gender reassignment, which by the way the Johns Hopkins University unit stopped doing it because of the incredible damage that it does to those who regret it, and those numbers are never discussed. Would I be brought before? I mean, in other words, is this interview illegal? You asked this rhetorically a few months ago, Professor Peterson, about the very lectures you gave last September. Would they have broken the law? I call Bill C-16 crazy. Is it illegal to call the bill crazy?
Well, oh yes, it is. There's no provision to make criticizing the bill itself illegal. There is provisions, as far as I can tell, to state your intent not to use the pronouns. I think that's illegal. Right. And then you might say, well, the good professor is being slightly paranoid, let's say, about that, which is what
hyperbole.
Kosman and my other legal opponents, none of whom would debate me at Queen's University, by the way. They were all asked. The entire law faculty there was asked to debate me on Bill C-16, and only Bruce Party stepped forward, and he played devil's advocate. And so, but in any case, what's illegal in all likelihood, it was for me to proclaim that I wouldn't use the pronouns, which is what I did. And I said that was probably illegal. And then, of course, the university so happily came out with 2 letters censoring me, stating that my actions making that video likely violated the university policy, the equity policies, forget about the free speech policies, because why bother with them? And that I might have been violating the Ontario Human Rights Code, which is exactly what I said in the video. It's like, so the fact that we're discussing the bill isn't illegal, but if we put forward a claim that we were unlikely to use the made up gender pronouns, let's say, or refuse to call someone who wanted to be called she, then I think that the Ontario Human Rights Commission would have grounds to come after you because they can act on their own, or the Human Rights Tribunal can.
I think some guerrilla journalists are going to test this. I've been talking to people and strategizing different things that you could do to show the absurdity of it. Like, go up to Prime Minister Trudeau and tell him that you prefer the pronoun "I'm the king of the damn universe," or that your pronoun is an unpronounceable chirp combined with a tap dance. And if he refuses, bring a lawsuit, and then we'll see how if whether or not there's a single law or different people are treated different ways.
Well, as far as I can tell, it's like the federal government is probably misgendering trans activist types right now by sending them letters that are addressed to them as Mr. or Ms. or what. I think those are the 2 that they use. Because how the hell does the government know?
Correct.
And so how is the government going to keep up if they happen to be talking to someone whose gender identity switches every day? Well, so then I guess the issue is we're not going to use any gender identification whatsoever. But that isn't a solution, because what if someone who has a mixed gender identity or isn't even on the spectrum, whatever the hell that means, wants to use a pronoun and then aren't being referred to it? So well, we'll find out what's going to happen. What's going to happen is going to be a legal mess, and the way it's going to be, here's how it's going to be paid for and by whom. So if you go to the social justice, if you're hauled before a social justice tribunal in Ontario, so basically someone will register a complaint, their legal bills will be taken care of as the complainant. Yours won't as the defendant. And so what happens, so not only will you lose, because you will lose, because everybody who's a defendant loses in front of the human rights tribunals, it'll cost you your tremendous legal bill and then whatever penalty they put on you. And that's how this is going to be so-called tested in the real world. Is
that already been tested with respect to parents who won't go along with the transgender child in Ontario for adoptions?
I don't think that's been tested yet. I don't know for sure, but I know that the legislation it's already made it clear is that if you have a child who identifies as transgender, say at a very young age, whatever that means, which could be as simple as a casual statement one day, like "I wish I was a girl" sometimes, then first of all, you don't report that to the parents. Second of all, you can change the child's gender identity at school, and you don't have to inform the parents. And if the parents object, then that constitutes a violation of the child's rights that's sufficient to allow the government to step in and take away your children.
Right.
It's like, that's a fine kettle of worms, shall we say.
Senator Plett, for people who don't know who Dr. Ken Zucker is and his othering of people, did you mention him in one of your reading speeches? We were talking about Ken Zucker and his fate.
Yes.
Having a prudential wait and see. And so many kids, they go through stages where they're confused about all sorts of things. The idea of gutting their anatomy before puberty even, to leave them to sort out the damage later. I interviewed a guy called Walt Heyer, who for 7 years lived as a feminine identity named Laura Jessen. He changed his name legally and full, the mutilation operation, driver's license, legal name change, everything. And then began to drink heavily and tried to kill himself twice. And it wasn't because, apart from a spiritual awakening that he had, he would probably be dead, and now gives talks on him regretting his sex change operation. And so many trans activists have come back to him, sort of back channel, to say, no one talks about the suicidal ideation. I believe it's 20 times higher than the population.
Well, they do talk about it, but they claim that the reason that the suicidal ideation exists is because of the continued prejudice against trans people, both before and after transition. So they just write it off.
I asked George Baker, Senator Baker, on probably every committee meeting we had, used the argument that, well, provinces across the country have a law that is similar to C-16.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked every witness that talked about the suicide rate, I said, well, considering the fact that your province already has this law, and that the fact of the matter is that the federal legislation will really impact the smallest portion of it. I mean, clearly the schools, many of the hospitals, public washrooms are all controlled provincially, and that they have these laws. Whether there is any difference in the suicide rate since they had gotten these laws, and what made them think that this would be the answer to all of that, there was nobody that could answer that. And I would just like to make reference to what you talked about. I could hear you talk about Ken Zucker. And for people to, and the emails I have gotten from parents saying, Senator Plett, why can you not support my 3-year-old child who is identifying as a gender other than what he or she was born with? And I'm sitting there and thinking, how can a parent let a 3-year-old child, you don't let a 3-year-old child decide to go outside and play by themselves.
Yeah.
And here parents are wanting a 3-year-old child to decide what gender they want to be. It's appalling.
I just read an article about a movement among some millennials to ask their toddlers permission before they pick them up.
Yeah. That's
yes, absolutely. And I'm the critic on Bill C-206, which is a spanking bill. And of course, I am being told constantly, how can you support a child being beaten?
Yeah.
And it's not, how can you support a child being spanked? How can you support a child being beaten? I think there are two different things there. And if that law passes, it will be illegal for me to forcefully pull my child away from a hot element on a stove if that bill would pass.
Yeah. They put the worst construction and pejorative spin on something that has worked for generations. Worked on me, I'll tell you.
And me.
Well, there are times when swift, effective intervention is the appropriate thing to do. So, for example, we could look at it practically. Let's say you have a child that's trying to put a screwdriver into an electrical outlet.
Yeah.
Like, that's a zero tolerance move. You don't do that. Or here's another one. It's like you have a toddler, say 3, and a more active one, who is tough-minded and disagreeable, and who isn't inclined to listen, and who likes to run away in crowded grocery store parking lots.
Yeah.
It's like, you die when you do that. And so you need to implement a punishment. Now, and perhaps it's not spanking, but we need an alternative. You would need to implement a punishment that's instantaneous and sufficiently serious,
and
so that
proportional.
Proportionate, exactly. Well, that's basically the legal issue, is the proportionality. And you also have, I saw my daughter, for example, once. No, it wasn't my daughter. It was the sister of a particularly ill-behaved toddler who got walloped across the head with a metal truck. It's like, okay, what's the right reaction to that? And I saw what the mother did. The mother picked the son up. She ignored her daughter completely. She picked the son up and patted him and said, that's really not the way to behave. It's like all she did was reward him. She was such an incompetent parent. She left her poor daughter. She basically rewarded the boy for being a pathological bully. And I think she did it with intent, conscious or otherwise, but with intent. Because lots of people raise their children to be pushy, nasty little bullies.
Well, this comes full circle to Bill C-16, the incursion into your private thoughts and intentions, as though the government has magical soul reading apparatus that if you don't want to go along with these, as you've called them, Senator Plett, an infinite variety of fluid definitions in that no man's land called, intergender world. I can't even keep up with them. What is there, 51 now, 60, 100? But potentially hundreds. 70
Yes, there's a
something?
potential. They
70
say
plus.
yes, they say quite straightforwardly, the more radicals, that there's an infinite variability. So, and with regards to the earlier issue about the suicidality of the high rates of suicide among transgender people, Brenda Kosman's quite straightforward on that too. She said, as the history of movements for racial justice and women's rights have shown, anti-discrimination laws are limited in their ability to tackle structural inequalities. And the structural inequalities that trans and gender non-binary individuals face are monumental. And so,
Yeah.
you have a whipping boy right away. If there's a high suicide rate, it's because that's obviously evidence for systemic discrimination.
Right.
You can't, the right argument is this. There's a pool of people who are extraordinarily confused about virtually everything. And that confusion manifests itself in such things as alcoholism and drug abuse and depression and high levels of anxiety and suicidality. A subproportion of them believe that their problems are caused by gender misalignment, and rightly or wrongly, but some wrongly, and let's say some rightly, for all that matters. But the point is that the ones who get that wrong aren't going to cure their large panoply of psychiatric problems by turning to gender reassignment as a solution. And so the suicidality remains intact, but it doesn't matter, because all you have to do is attribute that to the continuing discrimination on the part of the broader society. Again, it gives you a lever to keep bringing the thing down.
Except that go ahead,
there's
Senator.
no debate. There's no debate allowed on any of this. That's to me the frustrating part. I can have a different opinion than you, or a different opinion than anybody else, but there's no debate allowed on it. I was called a bigot and a racist by a fellow senator in the chamber because I referred to the transgender community as these people when I asked a very serious question when a colleague was talking about gender parity in the workplace. And I asked him the question that with gender parity, and I agreed with his speech, but with gender parity and a woman decides to become transgendered, how do you deal with these people in this type of a situation? It was an honest and sincere question.
Sure. In
her maiden speech a week later, the senator used the phrase, what I had done was othering. Now,
othering.
I'm not a lawyer or a teacher or a human rights activist. I didn't know what othering was, but of course she explained that was a form of racism and bigotry. The Justice Minister herself referred to the transgender community as these people. She wasn't a racist or a bigot, but I was.
Sure. Well,
there's an interesting case that happened at Wellesley. This is really comical. So Wellesley is an absolute rat's nest of this postmodern neo-Marxism. And there was a case, I hope I get this right, but I've got it close, where a biological female transitioned to a male identity and then was criticized for being part of the students' union because by undergoing that gender transition and being elected to the student body, maybe it wasn't Wellesley, but I've got the story mostly right, then they were now part of the oppressive patriarchy and and were therefore invalidated in their political stance. Yeah. So these issues are going to arise because they have to, because the legislation is building in internal contradictions that will only be played out in that kind of idiocy.
It's already worked itself out in ugly ways in the sporting world, where you have male-born MMA fighters transition and pummel their opponents.
Oh yeah.
By the way,
they're breaking female records in all sorts of different sports disciplines.
Back to the 20% suicide increase. Actually, that comes from Sweden. That was a longitudinal study in Sweden. So Sweden had the first gender reassignment unit, very, very kind of left-wing socialist paradise, and that's where the huge jack-up of suicidal ideation happens. I mean, that's where it was discovered. So not in some fascist far-right banana republic. It was Sweden that came up with that. So in a culture that's very pro and uber tolerant of all things, and they're still trying to kill themselves. Houston, there's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, there's a reason that Johns Hopkins shut down its gender reassignment clinic. But all of those things that you just laid out there, Patrick, they fall into the category of hate facts.
Right.
It's a phrase I really like. I don't
hate
know
facts,
where I
yeah.
came across. Hate facts, yeah. I love hate facts, man.
Hate, yeah. Boy, do hate facts really not care about your feelings?
They really don't care about your feelings. They're facts that don't care about your feelings. You know, we should definitely stop from a strategic perspective ever allowing opposition to bills like Bill C-16 to be cast as opposition to transgender people. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, that just plays into the hands of the people who like to describe everything that doesn't agree with their nefarious plotting to impose their ideology on everyone in sight, and every institution in sight, to tar their opponents as uncaring bigots. It's like, yeah, well, you know, it's not so obvious to me that I'm an enemy of transgender people. So,
as your transgendered supporters will happily exclaim. I think there's something similar here to the battle over the redefinition of marriage in Ireland. Senator Plett, I wanted to ask you about, just as someone who heard all the testimony and who have argued persuasively, I think, the Irish who wanted to have marriage retained in its definition as the lifelong union of one man and one woman, they were called the no vote. And people who wanted the change were on the side of yes. It was kind of hopey, changey thing. Same thing here, right? You were kind of, by definition, by default, on the defensive, as opposed to proclaiming values that are positive and balanced, but you got cast as the no vote. You're against progress. You're against change. You're against improvement.
Well, Patrick, you're absolutely right. And of course, the argument was continually being made that you are stopping these oppressed people. You are stopping them from carrying on with their life. You are absolutely anti. And I guess the term critic of a bill lends itself to having that title, maybe, but without a doubt, there was no openness to listening to the arguments that were being made by our witnesses like Jordan Peterson, Gad Saad, Bruce Party, and others. Mm-hmm. We were all considered as the no vote because we were preventing a group of oppressed individuals from carrying on a normal life.
Mm-hmm. G.K. Chesterton said that you should not tear down a fence before you know why it was erected.
Well, I absolutely agree with that, and I am frightened for the directions that we're going, because we are going. We talked earlier about, is this the beginning? I don't know. I don't think it's the beginning. I think we're well advanced and moving very, very rapidly.
More horses.
Well, you know, the next thing that's going to happen in Ontario, it's pretty damn clear, is that before Kathleen Wynne runs out her dreadful and deteriorating mandate, I think the last time I looked, she was under 12% for population. That's our premier, right? And which means that if she had an ounce of integrity, she would have resigned and called an election, because that's what you do in Canada when you're that unpopular. Left, right, center, it doesn't matter. At some point, you're that unpopular, you go for a mandate from the population. That's the bloody English common law tradition. And her cronies and her ideological cronies are pushing the quota and equity bandwagon now, just as, I don't know if you push a bandwagon, maybe that's what you do, but they're pushing the equity bandwagon just as fast as they possibly can. And so that's the next thing, is that and that whole I don't know where this whole equity thing emerged. It's just come out of nowhere, and all of a sudden in the last 3 or 4 years. But you know, it's predicated on the idea that everyone at every level of every organization has to be slotted in on the basis of their multiple ethnic, racial, and sexual identities, which of course is impossible even in principle, which I think is actually the point. So there's plenty of places where more damage can be done, and it's going to be being done as rapidly as possible.
Bill 89 in Ontario is a horribly frightening piece of legislation, and Professor Peterson is quite correct when he talks about Kathleen Wynne, and we have a prime minister who who came out in the last election and said, if you are even remotely in favor of the sanctity of life, you cannot run for my party. So he is taking democracy out at the very start, and you are not allowed to have a certain opinion if you want to run for the Liberal Party of Canada.
Is that the only way to get this law defanged and scuttled, is if the Justin Trudeau government is defeated in the next federal election? Is that the only way to do it?
I would say that is probably the only way to get rid of this legislation. But the electorate in Canada, as anywhere else, has got to stand up and take a hold of this and tell our elected politicians that this is what we stand for, and if you don't, we will elect somebody else.
Yeah.
So I just gave a speech in front of a bunch of progressive conservative people in Ontario at the provincial level. And Patrick Brown is the leader of the Progressive Conservatives in Ontario, and he's basically playing a wait-and-see game. He's hoping Kathleen Wynne will flame out and that the Conservatives can just get elected without really putting any positive doctrines at all forward. So, which I think is it's a prudent strategy, but it's not one that I would adopt. I suggested to the people who were in that audience that the goal of the Conservatives in Ontario should be to ensure that in the next election there's not a single Liberal left sitting. That'd be a good rallying cry, to get rid of every single one of them. Because, I mean, not only has Kathleen Wynne is not a Liberal. She's a radical leftist, and the radical
well,
leftists.
Well, and I support that, Professor Peterson. You are absolutely right, and even our conservative parties need to take that kind of a stand, because the conservative base does not adhere to what is going on, and for our leaders to take a wait and see attitude, I think we need to stand up and be counted. Now, it's easy for me to say that. I'm not elected, I'm appointed, and so it's easy for me to stand on my soapbox, but nevertheless, I think we need to stand and be counted at all times.
It's not very Braveheartish, is it? Wait and see.
No.
I just gave a talk that I put on YouTube, that I just put it up today, where I outlined 12 principles for a 21st century conservatism. And that also addresses the issue, Patrick, that you described earlier, that too often, because conservatives are conservative and say, let's say somewhat tradition bound. One of the things that's quite fun during all this, though, is to actually watch what's happening with the so-called mainstream media in Canada. Like, the Globe and Mail, for example, about a month ago, had in the midst of this debate about cultural appropriation in Canada, that has journalists in Canada running scared, let me tell you, because I talked to about 10 of Canada's major journalists after the cultural appropriation scandal hit the fan, and every single one of them told me either that they were self-censoring or that they were being censored by their editors. And these were the 10, I would say, the 10 most powerful print journalists in Canada. What's really interesting, though, is that so the Globe had a bunch of their new journalists make a video about cultural appropriation and how to handle other people's cultures with appropriate sensitivity. It's an appalling piece of junk, and I think I'll take it apart on YouTube at some point. But, it's got like 2,000 views. No one gives a damn. And the Globe and Mail has lost almost 10% of their subscribers in the last 3 months. It's like, so although, as Senator Plett said, we don't have an alternative media in Canada, what we do have is a situation where, as the classical media sources like the Globe and Mail become increasingly politically correct, people are just abandoning them in droves.
Ordinary Canadians are fed up with the obvious bias, and everything is filtered through a political lens, and there's errors of facts all over the place. Senator Plett, I promised 45 minutes. Dr. Peterson, if we can stick around a few minutes more, I want to ask you questions about how the logos and the breakdown of social order applies here. But Senator Plett, if you hear from someone in the trans community who's been discriminated against as a result of backlash, because no one's talking about this, and I think Theron Meyer brought it up, you're going to have massive backlash against people on the employer-employee level, I think. People will not want to go near them because they don't want to get their business sued out of existence. And so there's a whole, it's the irony, isn't it? The culture of victimization doesn't see this is going to victimize them way more now, since they already have protections under the Canadian Charter. Yeah. Now I sound like a politician.
That's just an absolute indication that I don't buy for a second the claim of the people who are pushing this legislation forward that they give a damn about transgendered people. I don't think they care about them at all. They're just they're the next convenient group to exploit in the service of this insane anti-Western postmodern ethos. And I think all the evidence points to that. So including the fact that this bill, like if I was an employer, well, I am an employer as it turns out. If I was an employer, now in this situation, people are already terrified to employ people.
Yeah.
Because it's very, very difficult to extract yourself from an employment contract if you're unfortunate enough to hire someone who's real trouble. Yeah. It's like if anybody walks in and they have the air of any sort of trouble about them, the probability that their chance of being hired is going to decline is 100%. So because someone might have originally been inclined to think, okay, well, this person's a little on the odd side and we're not exactly sure how they're going to do facing our customers. But if they're competent, no problem, and we'll give them a try. And most decent people, I would say, especially ones that are properly economically oriented, will choose competence over identity at every stage of the investigation.
Sure.
This just gives them every reason to think, no, man, you're such a pile of potential legal trouble that I'm going to do everything I can to step away from hiring you, including maybe making the position itself go away. Like there's lots of things that employers can do.
That's right. Dr. Peterson, can you stick around a few moments more?
Sure.
All right, Senator Don Plett.
Till 2:30.
Okay, very good. I just want to thank Senator Plett for his work and for carving out time from a very busy schedule. I know you've got a lot of whip duties there and a lot of things swirling around, but thanks for being on the side of the angels. You have the moral support of millions of people. You may not know that from the proportion of nasty grams that you get, but your work's very much appreciated. And if we can, extend any support, let me know.
Real pleasure to be on. Thank you very, very much.
All right. Thanks so much.
Good to see you, Senator Plett.
Nice seeing you, Jordan. Take care.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
All right. So I'm going to put a link up to Senator Plett's site. I thought we'd just spend a few more minutes with Professor Peterson. Do you know if this is retro prosecutable? So if you wrote an email or you gave a speech that's on YouTube or somewhere published, and you used incorrect othering pronouns, and you're asked to change them and you decline to, is that also illegal? Do you know?
I'm sure that someone will serve as the painful victim scapegoat to test that particular hypothesis. I would assume, based on my reading of the Ontario Human Rights Commission policies, that this legislation will be used by the human rights tribunals in the most punitive possible way, especially with regards to employers, because the people who are promoting this sort of legislation are also profoundly anti-capitalist.
Yep.
And so one of the things that's frightening about the Ontario Human Rights Commission's policies is that they're written in a way that couldn't possibly be more weighty and troublesome for anybody who would dare to have a business that would employ someone who are obviously oppressive capitalists by their very nature. So assume the stupidest possible thing will happen, and I suspect that you'll be approximately correct.
What's your status now with regard to U of T? I understand you shook hands with the dean and everything's hunky-dory, even though those two letters, the letters didn't come, this is important, the letters did not come from HR or from the janitorial department, but from legal.
They came from the dean and the Faculty of Arts and Science, but they were, they obviously reviewed by their legal counsel, clearly, obviously. And so, what's happened at the university is, the U of T isn't an overwhelmingly politically correct institution. Let's get that straight. By university standards, it's pretty conservative. There are a number of disciplines, the corrupt disciplines, that have plenty of social justice warrior activists, and they're very well organized. And they went after me en masse to begin with. And the administration, whose basic policy is, how about we have the least amount of trouble possible, their response was, well, if this number of people are upset, there might be something to this. And I have some sympathy for that, because when someone pops out like a canary in a coal mine and says there's something rotten about our state, the first thing you should think is, especially if you live in Canada, is, no, there's something crazy about you. And so then the appropriate thing to do is to think, well, maybe you're a bigot, or maybe you're a conspiracy theorist, or maybe you're a racist, or there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I have some sympathy for the university's decision to assume that perhaps a professor had gone rogue and needed to be reeled in. Now, having said that, my sympathy was pushed and tested by the fact that when the university wrote me the letters to tell me to cease and desist, that they failed, and saying that they had, been under substantial public pressure from people within the university to call for my censure. They neglected to formally state that they had also received hundreds of letters and a 15,000 signature petition supporting what I was doing. So I thought there was no excuse for that. That was a lie by omission.
Mm-hmm.
But they did go ahead with the debate, so that was a plus. And the public pressure that was placed on the university was sufficient to provide them with a, let's call it an out. And I'm not trying to be cynical about this, is that, let's assume that the administration's basic goal is to have peace as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Well, because so many people came out to support me, it was the peaceful thing to do rapidly became leave the professor alone and let him go back to teaching, which I did in January, although I had a very bad health crisis in December, and I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do that, but luckily I was able to. And the students were very, very, very welcoming, and it went very smoothly. And the university has left me alone, like they generally do, which is one of the reasons I like the University of Toronto. And not only that, I should point this out, is that I recently asked to have my sabbatical advanced a year because I have a lot of things to sort out in the aftermath of all of this insanity over the last 6 months. And I've been kind of ignoring my graduate students and so forth. And they granted that sabbatical move. So I would say my relationships with the university administration in my department and at the higher level are, if not good, and in some ways they're good, are at worst neutral. So But I would say that I am protected in large part because I have an overwhelming support base. And so thank God for that. It's strange, but hooray.
I would think the way that the smugly puff generation think, that they're going to flock to your classes to test you, to demand that you do what Bill C-16 now has legal teeth to require you to do.
It turns out that testing me is not the easiest thing in the world to do, because one of the things that's been quite comical and ironic in this absolutely chaotic insanity that I've been in the last almost a year now is that I'm in a situation, and believe me, I'm saying this with extreme trepidation. I'm in a fortunate situation because what happens is that if I go out and give a public talk and I give the talk, then it goes well and I get to post it on YouTube and 200,000 people watch it. And if I go out and I give a talk and I get disrupted and people are rude to me and ignorant and curse at me, and then that gets recorded and gets put on YouTube, and then I get 350,000 views.
Yeah.
And so it turns out that going after me is a mug's game at the moment. And I think even the social justice warriors have figured this out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now, it makes you into it makes you into a victim, and they only want to be the victims. So don't make Jordan Peterson a martyr. Whatever you do.
It even more reveals every time they've come after me, they've done it in a reprehensible manner that I don't even have to talk about.
That's right.
I just have to film it and put it online, and everybody figures it out instantly.
Yeah, if you can't fix it, feature it.
Right, exactly. Now, initially, had a transgender student come up to me and said, "Look, I'd like to be referred to in this particular manner, and here are my reasons. And, do you think that's reasonable? And could I request that of you?" I'm an agreeable person. Like, my proclivity is to say yes to politely phrased requests, far too much for my own good. And I mean, you'd think that I was a disagreeable person because I've become famous for saying there's no goddamn way that I'm going to do this particular thing that I'm supposed to be required to do. But I would have been inclined, I know myself, I would have been inclined to say, okay, well, you're being reasonable about this. I can probably accede to it. And, I even find myself, when someone has been requesting the use of they to refer to them, it's almost instantaneous that my better nature inclines itself to do that. So I'll find myself actually using that pronoun. But now that it's law, it's like there isn't a bloody chance in hell. And that's what I would tell the student. It's like, look, we could have had a civilized conversation about this 2 months ago. But now that it's legally compelled speech, you can forget it. I wouldn't use those damn words under any circumstances that I can possibly imagine. So,
looking at this from a 10,000 feet above the tarmac level, through the lens of your writings on Logos, and I've been pondering your situation in light of that recently. And it seems that Logos, among other things, is it's the culmination of and the source of order, social order and other forms of order. Bill C-16 represents anti-Logos in a certain way. It's a form of legislated madness that has not been thought through and has lots of hidden bombs inside it that will jeopardize the security and the true social justice of the very population sliver that it seeks to protect.
Sure, but that's not because it hasn't been thought through. I mean, postmodern philosophy is anti-Logos.
You're saying this is all deliberate. This is all a push toward chaos.
I wouldn't even say it's deliberate. I would say it's an inevitable manifestation of the impetus that's embedded inside the philosophy. Now, for Derrida, that was purposeful. For Foucault, that was purposeful. Those guys knew what they were doing. I mean, insofar as anybody ever knows what they were doing. They built the impetus into the doctrine. And the doctrine unfolds in space and time as doctrines tend to, which, as was documented, for example, by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago. Like, ideas are attached to the real world, and they unfold in accordance with their internal logic in the external world. And so the fact that this sows discord and chaos, this legislation, and that it's incoherent and troublesome, and perhaps won't even serve the purposes of the people that it was designed to serve, that's all well and good because it serves the overarching purpose. And the overarching purpose, and you see this also in the unholy alliance between the feminists and the radical Islamists, is the overarching goal is to bring Western society to its knees. And so by hook or by crook, man, and this is a manifestation of that, a small scale manifestation, but the fact that they managed to get a lever into the compelled speech area, that's no trivial victory. It's like, okay, now we can make you say what we want you to say. It's like, what's next? Well, we're going to find out.
We're going to find out. I would be a good thought experiment. Where would the left come down on a trans activist coming up to a Muslim imam in Toronto and demanding the pronoun usage? Because that would be like a horrible dilemma. Do we support the right? Let's make it one step better. It's a Syrian refugee imam, right?
Yeah.
Which right will beat the other in the arm wrestle? The right to religious freedom that we would accord to Muslims versus the right to a tiny minority for their pronoun usage.
Yeah, well, I would say that the general rule of thumb is going to be to let the party who poses the greatest threat to the fundamental structure of Western civilization have the upper hand in the argument, which is why you see things like International Day of the Hijab. Because I would say that because the transgender population, activist population, poses a smaller threat to the phallogocentric structure of Western civilization than the Islamic supremacists. Then the Islamic supremacists get the award. They get their rights trump.
Gotcha.
Yeah, well, that's how it looks. We'll see. That's a testable hypothesis. But the fact that the Women's March, for example, in Washington was organized in part by Linda Sarsour, and she actually thinks that radical Islam is a feminist doctrine. It's like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, the otherwise known as what Lenin would call a useful idiot. I mean, come on, precisely. Open your eyes a bit wider. Yeah.
Yeah, her eyes are open. She knows what she's doing. She's just playing out the game, and the all of the countries in the world that have the worst record for women's rights are Islamic countries.
No question.
So, and that's, I would say, let's say I'm speaking as a feminist. I mean, I have a daughter, I have a wife, I mean, I have a mother. These are people I love. I want the world to work out well for them. And I want them to have every opportunity they possibly can, commensurate with their responsibilities. If my sense is that it's easy for the West to figure out who its allies are, and the women should be helping us out with that. If you have to enslave your own women to stop them from running away in terror from you, you are not our ally.
Yep.
Simple as that.
Full stop. Boy, that's a whole other tributary that could be a 9-hour conversation. We'll have to press pause. Thanks for your patience with some of the tech fall downs, Dr. Peterson.
Problem.
It's always a pleasure. I'm always, I come away heartily edified, and you give me a lot to think about. I get
Patrick,
massive feedback from my viewers. What's that?
Great. Well, check out the last video I posted, which is 12 principles for a 21st century conservatism.
Yep, I'll put that in the show notes as well. Also link once again to Maps of Meaning and to the self-authoring suite, which I'm trying to get back on the wagon. We're in the middle of a studio move, but I'm just, scales falling off the eyes. It's a amazing journey.
Great. Well, do it badly. That's the thing. You don't have to do that program well. You just have to do it, because even doing it badly is a massive improvement over not doing it at all.
Correct. Yeah, a lot of armchair critics love to throw, Nerf bricks at people who are doing things imperfectly. But over time, you do anything 10,000 times, you're going to get really good at it over time.
Bad first draft when you're writing something out, your life story or your plans for the future. A bad first draft is your best friend, because anybody can get a bad first draft out, and then you can edit it.
Like this show.
There you go.
Great. Thanks again. We'll be in touch down the road. If I'm in Toronto, I'll look you up. Yeah, you too. Thanks for your time.
Let me know when this comes out, and I'll tweet it, eh?
Yep, shall do. All right, and appreciate the A too.
You bet.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?